Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to this week's Q&A. I'm already all mic'd up with the lav mic from a video I was just shooting, so I'm just going to continue through and use this one. And this weekend is the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. I still need to pack and finish my presentation, so I'm very excited. I'll be on a plane early tomorrow morning, and I hope to see as many of you out there as I possibly can. So please hit me up in the Discord, in the conventions part. If you just at me in there, it'll tag me, and I'll try to be paying attention to my phone as much as I can. So definitely, without a doubt, I'll be on the show floor all day Saturday, same day as the panel. And I will be around Sunday, but both Friday and Sunday, I'm going to be meeting with a bunch of other people, hopefully recording some podcasts and all that stuff. So, yeah, can't wait to meet as many of you as I can, and please just hit me up. Twitter or on the Discord is probably the best way. But let's jump into the questions. First up, over on Subscribestar, I get two questions from the importer. I'll answer them in separate sections, so if I make a mistake on one, I don't have to re-record the whole thing. But the question is, what's my opinion on input lag when it comes to emulation for 5th gen systems? So PS1, Saturn, and N64, and especially for 3D games. So, that's a very good question, and that's something that I've talked a little bit about, but I really want to dig deep into it someday in the future. But the way those games work is a little bit different than the original 2D games that we were used to. And you're right, most of those games you will notice more input latency. And some of that is just simply because they have a frame buffer at the end of the video chain before it's outputted. Now, I normally wouldn't notice any input lag on that unless it was a game, like a fighting game or a game that's also available on a different console that maybe has more or less of it, kind of like modern games today. But it's an interesting thing because in my personal opinion, so this is by no means a fact or anything, I think 5th gen systems and up are going to be the systems that I prefer to use software emulation over FPGA, should one of those ever occur. I don't think any of the cores exist yet for FPGA, but that's simply because with emulation you could render them in higher resolutions. So a great example of this is if you watch the My Life in Gaming comparison of the different Symphony of the Night versions, they show you how the PS4 version renders some of the 3D graphics in HD. And I think while that doesn't really apply to this, it's just a great visual cue of what could be done. Because while 2D games, like Symphony of the Night, in my opinion, should just stay in their original form, integer scaled and all that, any of those 3D games will look better if they're rendered higher. And I really want to do an emulation video just all about all of this stuff. I probably won't get to it till next year, but it's when you look at something like Mario from Mario 64 versus some of the new 3D Mario games, you can see that it's the same game, it's the same feel, the graphics just aren't good enough. So in a scenario like this, so there's already a frame buffer, so it's easier to compensate for the lag through emulation. You're right, the input latency does vary on some of these games just with the original consoles. I think that in the future it's going to be more common and a really great practice to emulate these things as opposed to try to use other methods. Now, of course, if you're playing on a CRT with original consoles, that's always how to get that experience the best way. But if you're playing on a flat screen, you might end up getting a better experience rendering things in HD, and if you already have a faster computer as well, that'll certainly lower the input latency. And another great example of that is John Linneman's Virtua Racing video on Digital Foundry, DF Retro, when he shows the PS2 version of Virtua Racing rendered in high def via software emulation. So for me, for consoles that are 4th gen or pretty much any 2D games like that, I'm always going to prefer original hardware or FPGA emulation on CRTs. For 5th gen and up, I'm probably always going to prefer software emulation on a flat screen in HD in most cases. And then there's, of course, those scenarios in the middle, like some of the widescreen HD rendering modes in BSNES now. That's pretty tempting to mess with. So I guess my point of this long rant is just that I don't think 5th gen consoles and up input latency is going to be as crucial because there's already more of a buffer there, and I think there's a lot of room for some awesome emulation of those consoles. And even if they're not quite there today, they probably will be at some point in the future. And the second question is, with the announcement of Analog's overpriced Pocket system, does this give you any hope of having a Game Boy Advance, Neo Geo Pocket, and Lynx cores for the Mr. FPGA project? Well, a few things on that. First, I don't think the Analog Pocket's overpriced. We'll see how much they charge in shipping this time, but I think that's a reasonable price for what you're getting and all of that. And also, I always had hope of those cores for the Mr. project because everybody that works on that project has been amazing. And I think as long as we continue to have people willing to support the project and willing to help, that we'll see it grow and we'll see a lot more cores. So hopefully people don't get stagnant and expect more cores to appear out of nowhere. Hopefully more people keep joining the team and helping out. And I think that's kind of what's been happening. So yeah, I mean, I think Mr. is just starting what could be a pretty amazing thing in the future. I mean, it has the potential at some point, you know, in the far distant future to replace MAME altogether. I know that's a bold statement and that requires, you know, probably 100,000 hours of work. Just saying though, if somebody talked about MAME when it was first released and said they'll eventually get over 3,000 arcades, you'd probably roll your eyes at me the same way Mr. Devs are rolling their eyes at me now. But I really do think it could be how everybody uses those classic consoles and arcades in the future. So yeah, Mr. Team is awesome, and I have hope for all those eventually. Now over to Patreon, and I'll start with the newest question first, because why not? Zach, aka Retro Tinker, has Retroarch installed on a PS Classic and wants to know if there's any way to eliminate shimmering. So if there's any settings in Retroarch, that would help, but I don't think you're able to output anything other than 720p. And to be honest, it's my opinion that unless you really love the look of the PS Classic, I would choose anything else for emulation. You know, a decent PC with a powerful graphics card is always the best. But if you just want a little hobby device, the Raspberry Pi, I think the Raspberry Pi 4 is significantly faster than whatever's in the PS Classic. So I think, you know, what you see is what you get with that device. And if you're really looking for something to tinker on, try a Raspberry Pi 4. Maybe there's more options for the PS Classic, but I don't really think so. And if you really like the look, there are some pretty cool cases for the Pi 4. So I have a Super Nintendo and Genesis one, and there's a bunch of other ones out there as well. So I don't know, maybe look into that, but sorry I couldn't help more. Core X09 had a question about the Otaku switch with both RCA and SCART inputs and outputs. They want to know if there's a risk of sending voltage through the wrong pin on the SCART output by having a component input working. So the short answer to your question is no, you don't have to worry about that. But remember that each input and the output should only have one thing plugged into it. So even though there's 6 ports, if port number 1 has a SCART cable plugged into it, don't plug a component cable. And same thing with your output. You know, if you're using the RCA outputs to go to an RCA to BNC adapter to go into a RGB monitor, cool, but don't also have the SCART input plugged in. Use only one, because if you double up on it, what you're really doing is sending the signal. You're doubling the resistance and having the signal bounce between 2 devices. So while it won't add voltage to it or anything like that, it's still just not a good idea. And especially on the output side, you could risk damage to your consoles. So as long as you're in a situation like port 1 is SCART, port 2 is component, port 3 is component, port 4 is SCART, and you're using just one of the outputs, never have to worry about anything whatsoever. So hopefully that answered your question. Kyle Gamblin wants to know if there's a service similar to Voltar's Cartridge Modding service for people not in the US. So I think that's things like the 8-bitter and 16-bitter that allows you to patch your original cartridges with things like English translations and stuff like that. And while I don't know of anybody off the top of my head, the whole purpose of Zach making those was so that people could buy them and make their own modding a lot easier. So I guess I would contact any local modders around you, and even if they're not quite familiar with the service, if they're a decent modder and they watch Voltar's video on it, they should be able to pull that off pretty easily. So sorry I don't have any direct recommendations, but it should be a lot easier than some other things that you might need done that require a lot more complicated mods. Jason D asked, if a TV has, for example, 17 milliseconds of lag, Does that mean it's 2 frames of lag or just 17 milliseconds? So that is an excellent question. The short answer is when you're simply talking about display lag in that scenario, I believe it's just 17 milliseconds. What I would like to know is how does a combination of input latency and any kind of display lag or scalar lag affect that? So as you may have seen in some of the videos that I've posted recently, I guess maybe the Genesis Classic one was probably the best example. Using original consoles, it'll be a different amount of reaction time from when you press the button to when there's movement on the screen, based on when the input is received. So you see in that video the scan line coming down the CRT, and then you see the light come on, and if the frame is halfway being drawn, let's just say it'll now take 3 frames in order for there to be some kind of movement. But if it's all the way at the bottom and the input is pressed right before the console pulls the controller port, then it would be 2 frames, let's say. So that's why that's also not the best lag test, because it could always be off by at least a frame. So when you combine latency like that, that's what I'm really curious about is, if 17 milliseconds of lag plus 6 milliseconds of controller lag, that would almost definitely mean 2 frames of lag total. So it's another reason why I don't like Bluetooth controllers on classic consoles, because then you have, your average person might be using that on a flat screen, and even if you have a 0 lag OSSC, now you're still adding your TV's lag and the controller lag to that. So this is something that I've talked about in the Retro Roundtable, and I'd really like to do a deep dive, but it's going to be a while because I want to do a video about lag, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to get into this, but I hope so, because I'd really like to find some way to do real measurements and be able to get final data out there for people. So, that's why when I give the milliseconds for any lag that I've tested, I also give an approximate frame, just so people know that it's probably going to be a bit variable. But I don't know. Sorry, the short answer is 17 milliseconds. Hopefully I didn't confuse you with the rest of it. And hopefully within a month or 2, probably more like 2, I'll have a video out describing all of this stuff, with fancy pictures and stuff to make it easier to understand. Gourd Captain has a question about N64 HDMI output. They have a setup that's all direct HDMI hookups, so things like the Wii Dual, and I assume high def NES and stuff like that. And they would like an Ultra HDMI, but realize there's probably a long wait. So they want to know, would an advanced RGB mod be okay, or just do a RAD2X? Now, the advanced RGB mod is going to be required anyway, because I guess their N64 isn't one of the ones with the basic mod. So I think the question that I have to you is, what are the features of the Ultra HDMI that you're most excited about? If it's simply de-blur and you don't really care about anything else, yeah, the advanced RGB mod would definitely be the way to go. And you could use that with the RAD2X as well, as long as you just set the advanced RGB mod to 240p. You could have your de-blur and then go right through the RAD2X. I'm actually going to have a video showing and demonstrating exactly what that looks like when hopefully next week, maybe 2 weeks at the max. But if you really like things like, you want all of the extra features of the Ultra HDMI, you like the CRT filters, then I would suggest just picking up a RAD2X and waiting for an Ultra HDMI. Because, if the N64 is your favorite system and you really want the best you can get out of it, the Ultra HDMI is going to give you everything that you could ask for. So, hopefully I pointed you in the right direction there, but this is one of those scenarios where it really is whatever your preference is. But I'll be doing a quick review of the advanced RGB mod soon. I'm looking forward to check it out. I remember talking about it when Bordy first mentioned it to me, and this is the first time I'll ever be using one myself, so I'll have more info for you soon. Roman Munn said they recently purchased a VA6 Genesis that has overheating issues. That's really strange. I've never had a Genesis overheat on me. Out of curiosity, how do you know it's overheating? But anyway, to continue, they cleaned it and thermal pasted it, and it seemed to alleviate the problem for now, but they eventually want to replace the 7805s. So just get a 78S05. Definitely use thermal paste, just like you would a CPU. Clean it up with isopropyl, then add thermal paste, then stick them both together, and that should just be the solution for your problem. They're linked on the Genesis page somewhere. I'll try to remember to put the link in this video as well, but it's 78SO5, and they're a DigiKey Mouser and all that stuff. And another thing you mentioned is you saw somebody that replaced the regulators with cold buck converters. I'd be very nervous to do that, just because when you mess with the power rails, a lot of things could happen as a result. And I don't mind being overly cautious about that, especially when you have just a very easy solution available to you. So my suggestion, just replace the 7805s with 78SO5 and you should be good. Dr. Mookhouse had a pretty lengthy question regarding their setup, but it's actually a very easy answer. They have a consumer-grade TV with a component video input and an LG OLED that they'll be connecting one console at a time via the OSSC, and want to know if component cables are okay to use or if they should stick to RGB SCART. So this is the perfect scenario for HD Retrovision cables. First and foremost, they'll look amazing on your consumer grade TV, so you can just plug them in and not worry about it. And also on the OSSC, the quality will be identical to RGB. There are some devices out there that process component video weird. That's a very lengthy discussion that ends in the OSSC does a perfect job with it. So you could still tweak it the same way you would RGB. You could still get amazing signal, and you just use the same cable for both. And don't forget too that the HD Retrovisions have the adapters for their Genesis 2 cable that allow you to use them for Neo Geo and a bunch of other stuff. So you end up saving money. You know, you could buy just their Super Nintendo and just the Genesis 2 cable and a bunch of the adapters and cover a ton of your consoles. So overall, I mean, it's a great setup, two great displays that you're using, and it sounds like the HD Retrovisions are the way to go. So be confident that you have an awesome setup. Well, that's it for this week. If you're new to the Q&As, ask any question you want in the latest Q&A post wherever it is that you subscribe. So Subscribestar, Patreon, YouTube, Bitbacker, whatever. Doesn't matter, just find the newest post and post your question there. And I try to get to everyone every week. The only time I usually miss is either if I make a mistake or is if your question comes in after I start recording and then I forget to refresh the page or something. So any question at all, feel free to ask. And thanks so much to everybody who participates, and I really hope I get to run into a bunch of you at Portland Retro Gaming Expo this weekend. So thanks again, and I'll see you soon.